Oops. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Claudio Bueno. I'm an art professor here at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm starting this conversation on behalf of Gina Dent because we are having an atmospheric river here in California, and we are experiencing some power outage with no internet sometimes. So I want to start introducing, so thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. And with these amazing people like Elisa Larkin, Denise Carrascosa, Gina Dent, and João Simões. I want to give you a brief introduction to this talk. So it's in the context of the Visualizing Abolition program at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences. The Visualizing Abolition is directed by Gina Dent and Rachel Nelson. And at this moment, we have an exhibition called Seeing Through Stone at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, curated by Gina Dent, Rachel Nelson, and Lauren Dickens. And the Explode platform is presenting an art piece there. So yeah, I'm just reorganizing my presentation because to be able to speak some words on behalf of Gina. So today we have Elisa Larkin Nascimento. Elisa holds a PhD in psychology from the University of São Paulo, Brazil, and Master of Arts and Juris Doctor degree from the State University of New York, USA. She's the co-founder and director of the Afro-Brazilian Studies and Research Institute, IPE-Afro. She conceptualized and organized the Sankofa University Outreach course, Sankofa Affirmative Education Forum, and Sankofa Educational Action Group from 1984 to 2012. She is also the curator of Abdias Nascimento Black Art Museum exhibitions at major museums. She has written and edited books like The Sorcery of Color, the 4-volume Sankofa collection, Adinkra, African Wisdom Symbols, and Abdias Nascimento, A Luta na Política, the political struggle. And Denise Carrascosa is an anti-prison activist, lawyer, and associate professor of comparative literature at the Federal University of Bahia. She has been running the abolitionist project Corpus Indócil Bodies, and Mentes Livres, Free Minds, since 2010 at the Bahia State Women's Penitentiary, where she coordinates sentence reprieve through artistic literary creation workshops with women prisoners. She has created an editorial label for the publication of literature by women prisoners, the first title of which is Firminas em Fuga, Poesia, on the subject of abolitionism. She wrote a doctoral thesis on literature and prison in post-Carandiru, Brazil, defended in 2009 at the Federal University of Bahia. So Denise is also she also wrote the preface of Submundo, a book written by Abdias when he was, just a second, yes. He wrote the manuscript Submundo, Underworld, which was published in 2023 and prefaced by Denise Carrascosa. So thank you so much for Denise and Elisa for accepting this invitation to be with us in this conversation this afternoon. So I'm also speaking on behalf of the Explode platform, which I co-founded in 2014 with the artist and curator João Simões. Over the past decade, Explode has fostered experiments and practices in art pedagogy and social justice, both in Brazil and internationally. We organized this webinar as part of our installation Passagem, or Passage in English, which is currently on view at Seen Through Stone exhibition, part of the Visualizing Abolition program at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences. So installed in the IAS library, Passagem seeks to explore the various dimensions and meanings of the word abolition in Brazil, including spiritual, carceral, and community aspects, while also engaging with these practices in the United States. This translation process began with a collective reading by the Brazilian community in Santa Cruz when we offered the words to eschew an orisha associated with crossroads and communication, echoing the spirit of Abdias Nascimento, who did the same in his poem Padê do Exu Libertador. This poem was written in Buffalo, New York on February 2, 1981, which is Iemanjá Day in Brazil. And now João Simões will read a short paragraph, short part of this poem in English and then in Portuguese to you before we start this conversation, but opening this conversation with Exu. Yeah.
I offer Exu the above my words. In this padê that consecrates you, not me, but mine and yours, brothers and sisters in Olorum our Father, who is in the Orum. Laroye. Ofereço-te, Exu, o ebó das minhas palavras, neste padê que te consagra. Não eu, porém os meus e teus irmãos e irmãs, em Olorum, nosso Pai, que está no Orum. Laroye. November 20, in Brazil, is celebrated the Black Consciousness Day, linked to the death of Zumbi, leader of the Quilombo dos Palmares, in Serra da Barriga, now state of Alagoas. One of the pioneers of the resistance to slavery of Africans by the Portuguese in colonial Brazil. And if you are in Santa Cruz or around, tonight at 6 p.m., the collective Frente 3 de Fevereiro presents the lecture Art, Technology, and Activism in Brazil in person at the IAS. Thank you very much, and now I give the word to Elisa. Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, João e Cláudio. It is wonderful to be here with you and Denise and Gina Dent. I was supposed to be at the Serra da Barriga, but I was unable to go. IPE-Afro, the Afro-Brazilian Study and Research Institute, is in Rio de Janeiro, which is where I am now. And I think that today's webinar is a great honor for me to be part of, because it's such an amazing mixture of art and activism and thought, intellectual exercise. So thank you so much for inviting me. I think that there is a certain care in not informing people, because I do have other things that confirm my biography, but it's also interesting to say that I was Abdias Nascimento's life partner for 38 years. The last 38 years of his life, I was with him. And the reason that I met him was because of the abolitionist cause. I was working on the Attica brothers' legal defense. I was a young still undergraduate. I had left school at Princeton to return to my hometown, which was the site of the Western New York judicial system, which was trying the prisoners at Attica who had rebelled in 1971. And when there were 43 deaths, all of the deaths were caused by the repression of the rebellion by the New York State, Governor Nelson Rockefeller's state police. And the prisoners were charged with all of those deaths. And I had been involved in other political activities, including the movement for divestment of Princeton University from South Africa's apartheid regime, from companies that invested in the apartheid regime, and also in the movement against the war in Vietnam. And so I was tired of the ivory tower, and I returned to my hometown and was involved in the Attica Brothers legal defense. I had a lot of hot discussions with people who didn't understand colonialism, the women's movement, or the fight against racism as legitimate fields of struggle, that only thought that the class struggle was what we had to deal with. And I had been to Brazil, and I had already fallen in love with Brazil. Friends of mine who knew that said to me, there's this professor at the State University of New York, you must look him up, which I did. And it turned out that that was Abdias Nascimento. So that was how we started. And the reason I tell that story is because when we see the book, which has already been mentioned, Submundo, or the Underworld, which he wrote in 1942 when he was in prison at the Carandiru penitentiary, which in 1992, the same institution saw a rebellion as well. His life was obviously, marked by that event, and mine as well, with the Attica struggle. So I wanted to begin with that, and also to say that what I want to do today is bring you some an overview of Abdias's life and work, and saying at the outset that his two major concepts, which he brings to the world initially in 1976, 77, we were in Nigeria at the Festival of African and Black and African Arts and Culture was taking place in Lagos. He presented his thesis about genocide, the genocide of Black people in Brazil, which at that time was considered an absurdity. It was also, he also was the one who kind of brought the idea that Brazil's Black population was the largest Black population, the second largest in the world, second only to Nigeria's, and those were things that were seen as really off the wall at the time. So the thesis about the genocide of Black Brazilians, which shows how the genocide is carried through not only through killing people, but it is the extinction of life as culture, as memory, as all of the aspects of human existence. I'm going to start a presentation, and I hope that I can share it correctly with you. Okay, can we see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good, wonderful. Okay, so this is what I want to show you, and I will ask Claudio and Joan to help me with time. It's a lot to say. It's very difficult to speak about Abdias in 30 minutes, but I will try to do that. This year we commemorated his 110 years of his anniversary, his birth. And this is the Ipe Afro's sort of visual rendition of that, with the Adinka symbol of the strength of the heart and the mind, as opposed to physical strength prevailing during any means. So here's Abdias when he arrives in Sao Paulo in 1929, at 14 years old, and enlists in the army to get out of a very small town in which he had been subject to various racist situations of racial discrimination. He enlists in the army. And when he is in the army in the early 30s, very early 30s, he is involved with the Brazilian Black Front, which was a major Black organization against racial discrimination. This is a picture of some of them in front of their school. They actually created a school. Education is a major issue and goal for African Brazilians in the movement. And the Brazilian Black Front, here is this very young adolescent in the army, and he attended some of the public manifestations of that movement. And it's important for us to make that reference, that the Black movement has been resisting against racism from the time that they set foot in Brazil quite early in the 16th century, 1530 at least. This again is the cover of the book. When Abdias, several things happened before this, but the Submundo is the book which he writes in the prison. It's his prison memoirs. At the time when he returns to Brazil after a long absence, during which he was traveling through South America with a group of poets who went to see the play The Emperor Jones by Eugene O'Neill, which at that time was having a sort of second round in the United States with Paul Robeson. It had premiered with the Black actor Paul Gilroy in 1920. And they saw this play done by an Argentinian theater group with a white actor in blackface. And at that moment, Abdias said, when I return to Brazil, I will create a Black theater movement to fight against racism. At the time, theater was the major cultural expression. And when he returns after spending a year in Buenos Aires with a major theater company to learn the different aspects of theater work, he returns to Sao Paulo and he is imprisoned. He's arrested, having been convicted in absentia, in other words, with no right to defense, for an incident that had led to his being excluded from the army in 1935. So the civil justice system had to see him. His exclusion from the army wasn't enough for them. They had to see him in prison, and he was judged and convicted and sent to the penitentiary. And there he created his first theater movement, which was the Convicts Theater. And this newspaper clipping shows this is he. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is he in one of their presentations. It was very big at the time. And then when he leaves prison, he arrives in Rio de Janeiro, and with a group of artists and intellectuals, they founded the Black Experimental Theater, Teatro Experimental do Negro, on 13th of October, 1944. So as well as the 110th anniversary of Abdias's birth, we are also celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Black Experimental Theater this year. Aguinaldo Camargo was another of the important leaders of the Black Experimental Theater. TEN stands for Teatro Experimental do Negro. And they also were educators. The issue of education, the need to educate is so central to all of the Black movement. And so for one of their first activities was literacy classes, because they sent out a call for people to join the Black Experimental Theater, and many of those who went to join, Black people from working people, did not know how to write and read and write. And obviously for the theater, you had to be able to do that. So here we have Ironides Rodrigues, one of Tain's important intellectuals, giving one of the classes there. They also had classes in general culture. This is a picture of Abdias directing Aguinaldo Camargo in what would be their premiere show. And of course, it was Eugene O'Neill's play, The Emperor Jones, with a Black actor, not in blackface. And there is Aguinaldo Camargo as Brutus Jones, in the major role in the play, at the Municipal Theater of Rio de Janeiro, which was it's a very important theater. At the time, Rio de Janeiro was Brazil's federal capital. It was the national center of culture, without doubt. And so it was very important that they were able to secure the stage at the Municipal Theater. And the date that was given to them before, ahead of time, quite a way ahead of time, was the 8th of May of 1945, which many people will recognize as the day of the victory of the Allied forces on the European front in World War II. And the armed forces in Brazil, which had fought on the side of the Allies, they thought that the Municipal Theater was naturally the place that they should hold their celebrations. But Abdias had only that day, the Black Experimental Theater had only that day. And what he said was, what better way to celebrate the victory over racism than for the Black Experimental Theater to premiere at the Rio de Janeiro Municipal Theater. This was a very big victory, the fact that he was able to maintain the day for the Black Experimental Theater. And here we have a cast of another play. The second important front that they needed to work on was literature for Black actors and casts on the Brazilian stage, because Brazilian dramatic literature, generally theater in Brazil, only brought Black people in very stereotyped and degrading roles, like the famous Black Mammy or the Uncle Tom or the Little Pickaninny, so they needed a new dramatic literature. So we have just, as part of the 80th anniversary, we have just published a new edition of the Black Experimental Theater's anthology, Dramas for Blacks and Prologue for Whites. This is the cast of one of the plays written for the Black Experimental Theater, dealing with Black culture and issues, the Black experience in Brazil. and it was one of their major plays. The Black Experimental Theater was very, very much a part of the cultural scene at the time, so much so that when Albert Camus visited Rio de Janeiro, he was received by the Black Experimental Theater. Here's Abdias, and this is Albert Camus, watching a reading of his play Caligula, which unfortunately they were unable to actually put on the play as a theater production. They weren't able to get up the resources for that, but they did the reading, and he was present at the play, and he comments on that in his memoirs. 1945 was a time when Brazil was coming out of a dictatorship and establishing a democratic regime. They had a national constituent assembly to write a new constitution. And it was in this context that the Black Experimental Theater was born. And they also, Abdias, Aguinaldo Camargo, Sebastião Rodrigues Alves, and others founded an Afro-Brazilian Democratic Committee, which was sort of a political arm of the Black Experimental Theater. But it was the Black Experimental Theater that organized the National Convention of Brazilian Blacks in 1944 and 45, which brought to the assembly, the National Constituent Assembly, a series of proposals for measures against racism. That was not the language of the time. No one could even think about talking about racism in Brazil with that word. But it was against racial discrimination. But they brought this series of measures to be considered by the National Constituent Assembly. During the elections, Abdias was very well articulated in terms of as a journalist and as a political actor, and the group itself. So they were able to get public statements of support for that set of resolutions from all of the political parties that were involved in the election, including the Brazilian Communist Party, the Brazilian Labor Party, the more conventional rightist parties as well. But when they brought these measures to the National Constituent Assembly, they had to do that through a senator, Senator Hamilton Nogueira. It was rejected on the allegation that there was no proof that in Brazil any such thing as discrimination existed. So one can see that, and in fact, all of those political parties, including the Communist Party, which sent to the assembly the only Black deputy, federal deputy in that assembly, was from the Communist Party, and he voted against those measures. The Quilombo was the name of the Black Experimental Theater's newspaper, and it opened its pages to candidates, Black political candidates from all parties. At that time, I think there had never been candidates, Black candidates for political office. They had always been, Black people had always been used by white politicians to support and carry forward their campaigns. So this was very important. This is the Quilombo newspaper talking about the first Congress of Brazilian Blacks, in which there were several important resolutions. And at the time, they were already in touch with the Pan-African movement. 1945, of course, was the year of the 5th Pan-African Congress, which took place with Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta and so many others in Manchester. W.E.B. Du Bois had been the leader of the 4 earlier Congresses, and Marcus Garvey, of course, is the great reference of the most popular, incredibly strong movements, Pan-African movements that brought together 30,000 people in the streets of Harlem in 1929, for example. So they were very cognizant of these movements, in touch with the Negritude movement led by Leopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire and Léon Damas. Abdias was in close touch with them. In 1968, they finally are able to publish the annals of the First Congress of Black Brazilians, which had taken place in 1950, 18 years earlier. And this book is called O Negro Revoltado. At the 1950 Congress, there was a resolution about the need for a museum of Black art, which the Black Experimental Theater took under its wing. And some of these paintings that you see behind me are part of that collection, which Ipe Afro now has in our care. And later, mostly when he was in exile, Abdias turned to his own work as a painter. But in 1955, the Black Art Museum project of the Black Experimental Theater carried forth a contest on the theme of the Black Christ, which was a scandal, of course. And it was at the time of the 36th World Eucharistic Congress, the whole Catholic Church of the world in Rio de Janeiro. This is one of the Black artists, Cleo, who is the author of this rendition of Black Christ. The Otávio Araújo does a Black Christ in a Rio de Janeiro favela. Here we have the theme is used by many artists. This artist is from my hometown, Buffalo, New York, Leroy Caldwell Johnson, painting called The Crucifixion. And Abdias, when in 1968, after publishing that book, the O Negro Revoltado that I showed you before, and also holding the first exhibition, the inaugural exhibition of the Black Art Museum, he turns to his own painting and develops it in exile when he goes to New York and then to Buffalo. This is his painting of the Orixás, a Teogonia Afro-Brasileira, the Afro-Brazilian Theogony. This is Oxum in Ecstasy. This painting, Exu Dambalá, is now at the Tate Museum. It's been acquired by them. And while he was in exile, he was very active in denouncing Brazilian racism. Brazil had always presented itself to the world as a nation of racial harmony, racial democracy. And he was at the Sixth Pan-African Congress and the preparatory meeting in Jamaica for the Sixth Pan-African Congress. Here he is in Tanzania with Salmon Nujoma, the leader of SWAPO. So the Sixth Pan-African Congress was really a landmark because it was the first time that Blacks, not only from Brazil, but from South America in general and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Cuba, because of the common way that racism was and eugenics were carried forward in all of those countries, because they all have this idea of the meta race or the la raza cósmica, or el color cubano. The idea that miscegenation and race mixture in those countries created a cordial society, as if Africans were not violently repressed, and if racism was not violently attacking African families, African descendants in all of those countries constantly as a race. So this was the first time that in the Pan-African movement that there was a major speaker, who was Abdias, representing the countries of Latin America and Brazil specifically. Here we have Abdias with Vasco Cabral, the Minister of Economics at Guinea-Bissau, right after the revolution, and with Molefe Asante. In 1980, Molefe Asante published his book Afrocentricity, and Abdias published his book Quilombismo at the same time. So and these two concepts were very important and revolutionary. So we had in 1978, as I said before, in Lagos in 1977, Abdias presents his thesis about the genocide of Africans in Brazil. With the Quilombismo, he sets up a different pole where he shows the idea of genocide, the idea of racist oppression, but as a counterpoint, he brings how Africans have always built their lives in liberty, in freedom. They have been able to not only confront racism, but build their own freedom in community, in art, in creativity. And this is the counterpart to the genocide. And it takes place entirely, principally from the model of the Quilombo communities, which were Maroon society in English, you know, the cimarrones in Spanish, or the palenques or cumbes in Colombia, Venezuela. They are in wherever Africans were enslaved, they were always fighting. They were always creating their own communities, which were not just escaped slaves, but they were communities of sovereign collectivities. The famous historian Richard Price has a beautiful way of showing how those African traditions are in those communities, and economic, cultural, political organization come out of that. And the indigenous people were always together as well. Here in 1982, after his time in exile, Abdias returns to Brazil and is part of the process of reconstructing democracy in Brazil. He was a member of the Brazilian Labor Party, and he made a very exceptional kind of alliance, politically speaking, with Mario Juruna, who was leader of the indigenous people, the Chavantes, at the time. Here they are together. The Memorial Zumbi was at that time moving back to the site of the important Quilombo of Palmares, we call Republic of Palmares, because it brought together many, many Quilombos in an area that is now comprises about half the state of Alagoas and half the state of Pernambuco. Its major area was in a place called Serra da Barriga, which we were part of a movement called Memorial Zumbi to disappropriate those lands and make a Zumbi memorial there. This is where everyone is on the 20th of November, the Black Consciousness Day, which was the day that was defined as the National Black Consciousness Day, because it was the day that Zumbi was killed in battle. This is Abdias with Mãe Hilda Gitolu from Salvador, who was on the donkey going up to the Serra da Barriga when there was no roads going up. Here's Abdias leading her along with Tosta Passarinho, the leader of Ededudu, the Black homosexual movement at the time. It had that, you know, the gay movement. And also Terena, leader of the Terena people. More pictures at Zumbi. This is Ailton Krenak and Abdias at the Serra da Barriga, and Palmares, the National Consciousness Day. So I think what I want to say to finish up is that, to me, the dynamics between the idea of genocide and Abdias's notion of genocide and his notion of quilombismo are actually coming together as an expression of abolitionism, because just as Africans are in exile in their own countries, those who are incarcerated are in exile in their own countries. And there is always this dynamic between being incarcerated, being in exile, being repressed, oppressed, and living, creating your own life in liberty, even under those circumstances. Thank you. And I'm sorry to take too long. Claudio, thank you for coming in and getting me to stop.
It was perfect, Elisa. Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation. Now we are delighted to invite Denise to speak. Thank you, Denise.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and for having this wonderful moment here in which Elisa can show us this wonderful, strong, and inspiring journey through Abdias' life that he handed in totally to us in honor of our freedom and our projects of freedom. Well, I'd like to say hello to the Egun of Abdias. So I'm sure he's here with us. So I'd like to honor, firstly, his Egun, his spirit, as we do in our Yoruba tradition here in Brazil, to say thank you to Dina Dent, Elisa Larkin, to João, Claudio, Gianna, who is here helping us with technological issues. And to say that I'd like to talk a little bit about my research with literature coming from prisons in Brazil. And to firstly, I'd like to say I'm absolutely involved in the abolition fights in Brazil because of my father, a Black man coming from Salvador, from a neighborhood, a Black neighborhood, together with my mother, where Mãe Hilda Gitolu, Elisa showed us in that beautiful photo with Abdias, created the Bloco Afro Ileaie. So there's the neighborhood, the Black neighborhood I come from. And in the 70s, the year I was born, this Bloco Afro Ileaie promoted, I'd say, one of these strongest spiritual and material historical connections to the abolitionist fight here in Brazil and in Bahia. So my father, coming from this background, he was a lawyer in the 60s, 70s, and 80s here in Salvador. And he taught me, he showed me some of the men he got free from prisons as a lawyer. He showed me how those men could tell stories that mattered, that he wanted to show me those stories matter to us. So he would promote meetings with men who had been recently free from prisons, and they would tell stories. How were their lives? What would be their dreams, their future projects? And it influenced me a lot to do what I do. I turned into, being a literature professor and a lawyer, and this connection between literature and prison and literature, and promoting some ways through which people could get free from prison in our country, from the idea of prison being the result, the natural consequence of race and criminalization of Black population. So that's what I do. And I'd like to begin talking a little bit of telling a little bit of my story, so that you understand my connection with this fight. Well, my research is trying to understand how this literature coming from prison has been divided, and it's a political division, racialized political division between literature coming from political prisoners, especially those ones who were imprisoned during the dictatorship regimen in Brazil, from 1964 to 1965, especially white intellectuals, and coming from the medium social class in Brazil, fighting a dictatorship regimen, and on the other side, testimonies and literature coming from Black imprisoned people who are not considered to be political prisoners, but criminals. So there's this division, and this racialized and racist political division promoted a very important consequence in terms of the documents we don't have of this massive incarceration of Black population in Brazil. We have publications in Brazil of political, in very commas, prisoners coming from this dictatorship regimen, but we don't have the publishing of this political documents, testimonies, autobiographies, poems coming from Black imprisoned people in Brazil. Only after the mentioned by Elisa Larkin massacre of Carandiru that happened in Brazil in 1992, we had some access to what was being written and produced by people imprisoned, Black, poor people imprisoned by our regimen. So we have very few publications, not, of course, documents or writings, but publications of this, of incarcerated Black people in Brazil. And Abdias document that was only written in the 40s in Carandiru in São Paulo, in a prison, but only published now, comes together with other documents we had access after, in the beginning of the 21st century. I'd say that in 2001, we have a publishing of a book entitled Memórias de Sobrevivente, The Memories of a Surviving Man, published by Luiz Alberto Mendes. And he had been incarcerated in the São Paulo's prison system during 30 years, from the 70s to the beginnings of the 21st century. And it's an important document of the techniques of torture, which continue to be permanent against Black bodies in Brazil, inside prisons and outside prisons. So what I'm trying to, I have a point here, I'd like to have it very clear, which is these documents we should study. We are beginning to find them now and have access to the publishings. They give us a photograph of how racial power is materialized in the technique of torture that happens into the prisons, but also outside prisons, because of policial violence against Black bodies in our streets, in the Black neighborhoods. But these documents coming from prison, they show us the continuity of this violence coming from slavery onto our contemporary times. Of course, the techniques of violence, they are modified according to new technologies of weapons and, for example, weapons using electricity, a lot of diversity of weapons. But what I'm trying to say is that we have to have access to these documents to understand this link between the torture techniques during slavery and the torture techniques in our modern times during the Republican times in Brazil. So how they perpetuate against Black bodies these techniques of torture, mainly through the prisonal system and through the polices, especially those polices that actuate inside prisons. So this is the first point I'd like to share here. How some of our documents coming from prisons and Submundo from Abdias helps us understand how, I'd like to read something from Submundo here, an excerpt, to give us some insight into this documental importance of literature coming from prison in Brazil. Carandiru, I don't know if I can read it in Portuguese. If I have to translate it, it's written in Portuguese. What do you say? Can I read it in Portuguese?
Yes, yes, do what, yes, you can do whatever you think it's better, yes.
Thank you. Carandiru é nada mais que uma várzea perdida na neblina fria, de onde ecoam vozes torturadas. So we have echoes from tortured voices in Carandiru. As vozes sem nome do Carandiru. The nameless voices from Carandiru. Aqui estou no território de proscritos, podridões, escombros repelentes da sociedade. Mundo de dor. It's a world of pain. Mundo em agonia. It's a world in agony. Mundo submerso no maior de todos os sofrimentos, o da perda da liberdade. It's an underworld, and we are suffering here because of a loss of liberty e do desprezo dos próprios irmãos. So for me, this literature coming from prisons has this function in our society, which is to show how violent, how perverse is the state and its techniques of controlling and killing, in many ways, Black existence in Brazil. So this is a document in this sense. But I'd like to move on to a second importance of this literature. We are very recently publishing and having access so that we can examine and use it as a tool, as an abolitionist tool for our fights. The second function or use, I'd say, of this literature, and of course I'm betting, okay, it's a bet here. It might be a way, an aesthetical and political way to unconvince society or to deconstruct in the social imaginarium our this identity that we have constructed along decades and centuries, that justice is a synonym of punishment. So this assumption is very rooted in our imaginarium, practices, and institutions. So when we read this literature coming from the memories, from the experiences of Black incarcerated people in Brazil, so the ways into which they can bind the documental exposure of torture, of the violence of state, and the rehumanization of people suffering that torture, I think that this connection between one dimension and the other has the power Two, of course, that mediations are necessary, but has the power to unconvince society of this equality between justice and punishment. So to unconvince society that prisons and police is the response to its problems. Prisons and police, they show up in this literature as some of the origins, the most important contemporary origins of violence in society. They emerge from this literature as weapons of brutality of the state. So for me, this would be, I'd say, the second power of this kind of literature produced in prisons in Brazil that we are learning how to read and how to deal with in our contemporary times. There is a third and very important aspect, feature, and performance, I'd say, concerning this literature, which is, I think it's a very powerful tool of rehumanization in basically three dimensions when someone is imprisoned. The physical dimension, the psychological dimension, and the spiritual dimension. And I will try to develop a little bit what I mean. When people, and I work with women weekly, I've been working with them for 14 years now. When these women, especially, they have access to, for example, Black literature here in Brazil, what we have been producing for centuries. And I'll mention, for instance, the abolitionist work of Maria Firmina dos Reis, our first abolitionist writer and novelist here in Brazil, coming from Maranhão, and she has written our first novel in 1856 named Ursula. And just a parenthesis here, we've constructed we've constructed a library in her honor 12 years ago. And it's, when people, these women, they enter the library and they have access to this literature, this kind of literature, a whole new world of possibilities, identity constructions, memories, historical roots. They appear to us to liberate that subjectivity, which has been incarcerated, not only physically, but spiritually. The meetings we have with those writings, with those memories, they're absolutely important for the reconstruction of their journeys in life, which are absolutely violated through the imprisonment system. So firstly, physically, they can get out of the cells, get out of the confinement itself, so that they can move into another space in prison, the library. Secondly, psychologically speaking, I have this testimony from a friend now, Roquelina Gomes, that had been incarcerated here in Salvador for 6 years and 11 months. We all know people in prisons, they're over-medicated. It's tons of psychiatric medication are given to people in prison to control them and to make them mentally ill. And this woman I mentioned, Roquelina Gomes, now a friend, I've been with her along this 6 years and 11 months of incarceration. She would tell me, okay, I'm exchanging a pill for a book. Whenever I get a book, I don't need to get a pill. And I'm teaching my companions here. I'm teaching the women imprisoned with me to do the same thing. And what I could observe following Roquelina Gomes in this process of imprisonment, comparing her with other women that would not read and would not write, I'm going to talk about writing a little bit later, is that the women who would not access the library because they didn't want to, or because they were stopped of accessing it for many reasons, they would be go mentally ill faster. And the loss of their subjectivities, the loss of their memories would be a lot more brutal if I compare them with Roquelina Gomes. So there is a physical and psychological liberation or form of fighting of the effects of incarceration in their lives. Spiritually speaking, we all know in Brazil that the prison is a place which is preferred by, is the favorite place for evangelization, Christian evangelization of Black people, especially here in Bahia, where Candomblé and other religions of African matrix are very strong still. And in this process, we have to combat, we have to fight off these development of the Christianization of our community. And when we, through books, through literature, reading and writing, we talk about our spirituality. For example, this year we're working with a Yoruba literary gender named Owe proverb. And working with these proverbs or proverbial literature, we are accessing some narratives, ancestral narratives correlating those women with their orishas or inquices or voodoos, their Black sense from their ancestors. And in this process, they are recovering, trying to recover through speaking of them and writing about them and reading those Owe's proverbs. They are reconnecting their spirituality and their journeys, human journeys, and community journeys in this society. So it's what I want to say is that a third, I mentioned two functions or forces of power of this process of producing literature in prison and connecting it to Abdias. The third one, I'd say this performance of rehumanization and subjectivization. And then I want to remind us, and Elisa showed us, that Abdias began his experience with the experimental Black theater in the 40s, incarcerated with the theater of the convict. And this documents concerning the theater of the convict shows us, and of course that we have to study more and to research more what Abdias, the young Abdias, was already experimenting with in prison, is that the performance, because when I mention literature, of course that I'm mentioning literature in an expanded perspective, not only the written one, but also the writing with the body. There are women who did not know how to write or read. If we think of these verbs concerning the text in the paper. So they write with their bodies, with performances from theatrical techniques. And Abdias was experimenting with this process of being the subject of your own memory, the subject of your own discourse, to to confront the prison technique of telling yourself who you are, or the police imprisonment, detention that tell yourself who you are in this criminalization performance. So, okay, do I have more time? I don't
Oh,
have.
Denise. Yeah,
I'm
sorry, Denise. Sorry to
no
interrupt you.
problems. No problem.
I'd like to invite you all to join the camera again. We have some time to a discussion with everybody here. We have, I asked people who are watching us to send questions for Denise and for Elisa. I'd like to start with one that somehow connects with an event that we promote during IAS with Moisés Patrício, the artist and Babalorixá. And Moisés Patrício, during our conversation with him, and Moisés made this lecture performance about Exu and about spirituality, and how spirituality is really connected to the abolitionist movement. And in some points, also Elisa and Denise brought this perspective as considering the Yoruba tradition, considering connection with Manhilda and everything. And I like you both to somehow comment about this perspective on spirituality, religiousness, and the abolitionist movement in Brazil and also in other parts of the African diaspora. If you, I don't know if can come, it starts, but thank you.
Bom, do ponto de vista do Abdias.
Oh, in English, please, Elisa.
Oh, I'm sorry. Going back to Abdias's life, which is what I was more bringing into this, he was brought up Catholic. When he was excluded from the army in 1935, he moved to Rio de Janeiro. And that was when he came in contact with African spirituality in Brazil. And it's often important in the United States. I have been in other contexts in which it's been important to say that in Brazil, you have the African tradition living today. In the United States, very often, Black people say that they need to look for what that tradition is because it's not available to them. Whereas in Brazil, you have that tradition living. And so the candomblé, which Denise mentioned, and which Manhilda, whom we saw the pictures of, is one of the authorities. Many of the authorities are women. And when he came in contact with that spirituality, with that, well, of course, he was very spiritual. He had wanted to become, he wanted to go to seminary and become a priest, but he had been told that if he went to seminary, he would not be a priest, he would be a lay brother. And so he said, I'm not going to be the, what will we call it? The servant of the priest. And that was a big deception. One of the documents we have here is a letter that he writes to the Archbishop of São Paulo, you know, at that time. So when he comes in contact with the African tradition, he is just, it opens a whole different path of existence. And one of the characteristics of that is that first of all, it's not an evangelical religion, it's a religion of initiation, but that it has no sense of punishment, of sin and punishment, and the idea that you are, if you don't do everything right, if you don't get baptized, you're going to go to hell, or you're going to be condemned by, you know, at the final judgment. So it was liberating to him, and it was also very connected intrinsically to the ideas of nature. The orishas are the forces of nature. So you are close to God. I mean, there is, of course, the Olodum is the one God, but you are close to him through these different aspects of creation, which are brought alive and which come to the human community and partakes of celebration with the human community. So it's a whole different thing than the idea of a spirituality that's in another world that's so distant that we have no real connection with. I think those were the things that really and so when he began to paint, that they were the forces of inspiration and of liberation. He always identified the Odisha. This painting right here is called Shango Takes Over. It's the American flag with the symbol of Shango, the double-headed axe of Shango. This painting here is blue Omolu, Free Huey. It was a painting that Abdias made in honor of, it's in fact, you can't, maybe I can get closer to it. This painting is actually the only, I'm gonna try and get closer to this. The only collage that Abdias made. And the collage is the image of Huey P. Newton. And he made this painting. You can see Huey P. Newton's face, which is it's a cutting from a magazine. So Abdias creates this collage as part of the movement to free Huey. So the Orishas for him were always part of the African liberation movement. They were always linked to the freedom of African people.
Beautiful, Elisa. I'd like to ask this, to answer this wonderful question from João. Here's the cover of O Pacto de Boca Pio. Elisa knows it. This is a play based on a performance that happened in prison. We organized it in prison in 2017 with imprisoned women. And there are some photographs here you can see from part of this performance. Here you can read Não Tem Ninguém Aqui. We call it Espada de Ogum, over this cloth and some paintings here. And in this pact of, it has been translated and it will be published next year by Jess Oliveira and Bruna Barros that work with us, yes, into English, in a group of a research group I've coordinated for 9 years, translating in the Black Atlantic. And this play, this performance, is mediated by some forces of nature. Some of them Elisa mentioned: Xangô, Yansan, Nanã, and Omolu. And here in the beginning, there is a wonderful and powerful force that gives us some passage, which is the Iami Xorogá, O Xorongá. We chant for them to open up the channels of understanding the problems of justice in our community outside of this punishment, racialized, violent protocols that have constructed our state nation, the whole project, anti-Black state nation project. So we're trying to work with our memories, our ancestral memories here in Bahia, here in Brazil, these African ancestral memories, to mediate perspectives, possible visions of freedom and other models of justice to deal with our conflicts. And this is one of the techniques. I didn't have the time to talk about this project we have together with imprisoned women, which is to publish their stories, their memories, their poems, through the mediation of this art articulated with ancestral memory, in a way to promote the broad dialogue, a broader dialogue with society, not only to advocate in favor of imprisoned people and against prisons, with rational discourse. Because we all know here, rational discourse are not leading us to many, victories in the field of criminal justice. Of course, we're dealing with that. We have to continue dealing with that, documental texts and law norms and technical discourses. But art, the role of art articulated with ancestrality, and Elisa gave us a wonderful example, Abdias, of Abdias' legacy to us of this connection between art and ancestrality. This is a path Abdias taught us to approach criminalization, to approach state violence, and when I use the word approach, is to reproach, is to go against it, to fight against state violence and police violence against us. So 3 dimensions here again: the voices of imprisoned women, visual arts, and ancestrality, ancestral memories, so that we can produce circulation of discourses which go against violent state discourses and violent police brutality.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Elisa, for answering this question. We have 2 questions for this audience, but I think we don't have so much time that we had to close in 10 minutes, this conversation. It was very good, it was very intense, but I think you have this limitation. But I will bring these two questions from the audience. One is from Pedro Moreira, most connected to the experience of Denise, and he wants to know how Denise works this boundary of books when you understand the idea of literature and documentation. Como é que você trabalha a fronteira dos livros enquanto literatura e documento? And I have another question more to Elisa from Jennifer Sales, and Jennifer Sales asks, thank you all for being here for this enlightening and important conversation. I'm really interested in the use of the term experimental in the Teatro Experimental do Negro, thinking of this term being used in relation to the avant-garde art movements in Brazil. I am curious if you could delve into a conceptual argument behind the experimental. I don't know if it's easy, but it's...
Elisa, you want to go first?
Okay, I think that essentially the title of the Black Experimental Theater had two controversial and important pivot points. One was the word Negro, né? Teatro Experimental do Negro, né? Many people who were considered themselves the friends of the project said, don't use the word Black in your title because you will doom yourself to failure from the very beginning. And it's very interesting that until to this day, it's often, when, for example, when we returned and the Black movement was creating the MNU, that was an issue as well. There have been many other companies that don't use the word Black in the title. The word experimental certainly, most certainly came, I see, obviously from Abdias's work with the Teatro del Pueblo in Buenos Aires, which was an avant-garde theater that used experimental theatrical techniques in the sense of they worked with improvisation, but in a way that was very different from what we think of as improvisation. But it was an idea of sort of moving away from the text or being able to be more creative with the text. But the text was always the text. You never, you know, it's very different today. Today you have the author of the play is like, you know, one of the elements. The text is only one part of it. Whereas at that time, and even if you read Abdias's play, everything is written in there. He tells the director exactly what the director is going to do, how the scenery is going to be, and so on and so forth. So I think that the experimental in that term shows how the Black experimental theater was embedded in what was then the modern theater, the most innovative theater movement of the time.
Okay, considering time, I will go to the first question, okay? This border between document and literature. Considering our idea of memory and the need of constructing Black memory, reconstructing and reinventing Black memory, this border should be blurred. That's what we try to do through performance, you know, through visual arts. So the platform, the documental platform to construct memory can be any platform, the body, visuality, you know, an image, photograph, painting, a sound, a song, whatsoever, a novel, a poem, whatsoever. So the thing is, in Brazil, we lack monuments to Black memory. So we have to build them. And building monuments demand from us having documents and transforming these documents into monuments so that we can visualize. This is to refer to cite Gina's program, to visualize freedom, journeys to freedom, memories of our history of freedom construction. So we kind of blur this and produce many passages from one side to the other, from the document to the art, literary art, whatever art we're talking about, so that we can build up a monument in many monuments, a monumental history of our existence, because this is one of the strategies, political and aesthetical strategies, that to rehumanize us and take us from this position of being targets of easy violence and state brutality. So this is, of course, something which is theoretical, but in practice, we're doing it all the time. It's not something difficult for us to talk about or to do, you know, it's praxis.
I think I think we have now 3 minutes to close, but Elisa, you want to say something, or?
I just wanted to compliment what Denise was saying, or to respond to what Denise is saying, because I see that is what I mean. What she just spoke of is what I mean when I talk about the dynamic between genocide, Abdias's concepts of genocide of African people and quilombismo. Because what he documents in both those books is the dynamic between the document and the creation, the building of life in freedom.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Denise, Claudio, and Gina, and everyone for being here to listen, to be part of this webinar with us. I don't know if Elisa or Denise have some last words to share. I think we have not only 2 minutes, but I think somehow it's important for us, for everybody here, you to let some final words. And again, thank you everyone for stay this 1 hour and a half with us together, thinking and talking about abolition, about Black liberation, about spirituality, and all the literature, nature, and all the things that we share together. Thank you. Thank you very much.